Hello, cinefans. I'm Kendall Cruver, and this is Watching Classic Movies. It's rare to find a new film book that is destined to be a classic, but Corpses, Fools, and Monsters, The History and Future of Transness in Cinema, is just that. Co-written by Willow Catelyn Maclay and Caden Gardner, this well-curated mix of films, criticism, and history covers the highs and lows of trans representation both in front of and behind the camera, and celebrates the wealth of trans talent now making films. I spoke with Willow about some of the standout films from the book, what it was like to write and research such a complex project, and what trans filmmakers need to thrive as they expand their presence in the movies. Welcome, Willow. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to discuss my book, Corpses, Fools, and Monsters, that I co-authored with Caden Gardner.
And I'm excited to talk about it. I read a lot of great film books. There's wonderful things out there, but I rarely read a book that I think instantly is going to be a classic because it hits so many of the right notes. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to thank you too for all the work that you put into this book.
Mm-hmm.
When I started reading it, and you even talk about this in the text about how it's a little bit like the celluloid closet, in the way it puts the information together and the way it addresses a topic that needs a good critical assessment, but to also draw people into great films and ideas. But
Mm-hmm.
it also made me feel a little bit like seeing Maya Cade's Black Film Archive for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How there were things in there that I loved, and seeing them together was really exciting. But it was
Mm-hmm.
also just, there's so much more to explore. And it was just this huge amount of information and new things.
Mm-hmm.
How did you two approach this? Like, what was it like going into this project?
The genesis of this project was a series of transcribed conversations that we had before either of us were professional film critics called Body Talk. And we at the time, we felt like we needed to centralize the trans voice in film criticism because a lot of mainstream film critics were getting things wrong, and our history was being misinterpreted in these broad ways. And there was a lot of new films coming out which were tackling the topic of transness, but trans people didn't have a voice in creating the conversations around those films. These were films like Sean Baker's Tangerine in the independent lens, and then movies like Dallas Buyers Club and The Danish Girl in a more mainstream lens. And we had a different opinion on these movies compared to what the cisgender film critics were having at the time, and we felt that it was important that we begin to create our own voice about these particular movies, but also with Body Talk, we wanted to look back at the history of trans images and movies about transness that were important in our own learning about movies and ourselves throughout the history of our lives and before we were even born. And when looking at this book, we always had an idea of kind of creating the trans equivalent of Vito Russo's The Celluloid Closet. And we kind of underestimated the amount of films we would end up encountering through this. Both Caden and I are hardcore cinephiles, and we had a lot of films that we knew that we wanted to look at. But in researching this project, we came across a lot of other films and a lot of other directors and periods and figures who were important. And we were even finding movies by prominent directors that we didn't know had made a trans film in the past that we ended up looking at in this book. Like a director like Penelope Spheris has a documentary about the trans woman Jennifer Michaels, and everyone knows Penelope Spheris for making things like Wayne's World, you know? So, we were in this situation where we had a group of films that we wanted to look at that we already knew about, movies like The Silence of the Lambs and Boys Don't Cry and Dog Day Afternoon, and then movies which had more of a trans lens that's more authentic to them, like Paris is Burning or Funeral Parade of Roses. But the amount of movies that we kept discovering and kept learning about through this process just broadened our topic to such a degree that we felt like we had to centralize it to a North American point of view, which is why a director like Pedro Almodovar isn't present here. We both felt like maybe we weren't the right people to tell that particular story, because Almodovar obviously has a lot of movies that have a trans character or a trans story intact, with movies like All About My Mother and Talk to Her. But through our research, we discovered what we wanted to cover and how it would play into this thesis of how transness evolved on screen alongside the political and medical realities of transness that people in North America were experiencing at the same time. And what we hope to do with this book, and what I think that we ultimately accomplished, was comment on how the films influenced the way that trans people lived and were perceived, and then how trans people were also influencing the creation of these films later on through our own integration into the film industry in a more direct way, where we had more control over the types of stories that we ended up telling about transness. And I think that we got to that point, you know.
That explains your choices to me a lot too, because, well, Pedro Almodovar, I mean, Grotto and All About My Mother is one of the all-time great characters ever, but he does cover such a wide arena, and it's a different cultural lens, and it makes sense that you had to make choices, so you made them deliberately.
Yes.
And I do feel that sense of almost a narrative here, where you're walking through different stages, going into different rooms, like, so that it's part of it is cis actors, part of it is trans actors, part of it is cis and trans creators, and then you also have this idea of how we all have our own perception of a film. For instance, The Cat People is a wonderful trans allegory.
Yes. It's one of my favorites.
That was a particularly beautiful passage of the book. And I don't know what it is that made it so beautiful exactly, but I think a lot of it is just the empathy in the writing.
Yeah.
And it did make me think about how powerful that is. Like what was her name? Sister Hyde. Drusilla Adeline. Is that the name? The designer and podcaster, talented at both. But she once said on Twitter, before it became a complete dumpster fire, that she saw Bell, Book, and Candle as a trans film.
Yep.
And that film is one of my favorites, but it had always been a little sad to me at the end, because I thought it was so cool that she was a witch and had these powers and was dressing in this black. And
she ultimately conforms.
Yeah. That's what I saw it as, is conforming. And I realized through looking at it in a different way, she got what she wanted. And I was able to see the film through the transition that she wanted to make, which just happens to be conforming. So that makes everybody happy in the 50s, I guess. But it was also, something that was perfect for her. I love that part of it.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we wanted to negotiate with our book was the relationship that trans people had to allegories and movies that didn't necessarily explicitly reference transness, but had an effect on trans viewers in a way that where we could see a pattern. We sought Susan Stryker at the beginning of the book, and how she likened the story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to a transgender experience. And I think that that sort of theoretical idea pulsates through the way that trans people watch movies, because I don't think you can look at the way that trans people watch movies and get around the fact that we don't really have access to the wider trans canon. We wrote about a lot of movies in this book that feature trans people in an explicit way, but a lot of these movies are hard to come by. They're hard to find. They're not easily available on DVD. And in the time that Caden and I were growing up in the 1990s and the 2000s, we didn't necessarily have access to these movies either, and we found them later. So I think that what happens with a lot of younger trans viewers, particularly ones that are my age, growing up during that specific time period, is we looked for transness in films that didn't necessarily have anything explicit to say about it. And this had an interesting sort of effect where trans people were gravitating to certain directors and certain films like David Cronenberg, David Lynch, Cat People, like you mentioned, I think that Bell Book and Candle is an interesting example. We didn't write about that movie in our book, but I can totally see how that works for someone as a trans narrative. And I think that there's something really curious happening right now in modern films made by trans directors where they're kind of relitigating that relationship and taking pre-existing modes and then filtering them more explicitly through transness. So we have Jane Schoenbrunn making a movie like I Saw the TV Glow with its obvious odes to David Lynch, but filtered through transness. And you have Vera Drew making something like The People's Joker, and that's filtering transness through a superhero lens. And you have Alice Mel McKay making kind of a body horror movie that has a lot to do with David Cronenberg in her film T Blockers. So we're taking these things that we like and then like making and then like forcing a transition upon them as people who are making films now that I think is really exciting. And I think that that sort of relationship that trans film creatives had as viewers is becoming an explicit part of the art that they're making now. And I think that that's one thing that is percolating through our book, how each of these films are in communication with one another, each one influences one another. One of the broader goals with this book is that we wanted it to feel like all of the films were in communication with one another, and that the past was in communication with the present, and that this idea of the trans film image was a living, breathing organism that was still evolving. And I think that it's emblematic of the way, and I think that our concept of the trans film image is really emblematic of our own history in watching movies and creating films.
I do feel like the book says this, but you put that so well as
Thank
far
you.
as the continuum of history. Like, I know that Jane Schoenbrunn, they love Iraqi, but I was definitely
Hmm.
seeing more of a Lynch thing. They'll see them in an interview with these, you know, incandescent with the love of film, just glowing and
Yep.
happy and smiling and enthusiastic. But then you watch the movie and it's like, oh, I'll just rip this heart out of you. It's so
Yeah.
intense and beautiful and
Hmm.
all-encompassing. So I'm
Hmm.
glad that you said that I wasn't the only one seeing that.
Hmm.
But I do see, especially with these filmmakers you're talking about, they're really taking control of the
Hmm.
process, especially
Hmm.
with McKay, where she's just, she has so much control over what she's saying.
Yep.
And I think that that's why she goes from something like So Vam, where
Hmm.
it's cute and I liked it, but then like each progressive film is so much more advanced.
Hmm.
And I know some of this is just being your young, fresh mind and learning, and you move more quickly. But I
Hmm.
also see that as being a bit about having control and like you say, taking all of those images and making it into something that directly affected her.
Yeah, and another really exciting thing about what Alice McKay is doing is that I think that people who are in Gen Z have a more healthy relationship to trans film images than people who are millennials because they had access to seeing trans people through social media and online spaces where they could have an interpretation of transness that wasn't rooted through a monocultural cis lens. I know in Caden and I's case, we were heavily influenced when we were younger by The Silence of the Lambs and Boys Don't Cry as these monstrous images of transness, but I think that younger people don't necessarily have to watch those movies to see transness depicted on screen. And I think that you can kind of see that in Alice's work in particular, where the way that she's approaching transness is more celebratorial, whereas Jane Shipburn is more our age, and there's this kind of push and pull and this kind of
Right.
conflict in repression and liberation that I think is really specific to a millennial experience of transness.
Just in that difference between them in a span of years, it's so dramatic and it kind of shows you
Hmm.
how quickly things have changed. And I
Hmm.
do love that you talk about YouTube
Hmm.
in the book because I know the trans kids that I know are getting a lot of information from social media and YouTube. We hear a lot about how it's
Hmm.
bad, but I really, and I've talked about this, with my own kids that it's a tool.
Hmm.
You can hurt somebody with a hammer and you can build something with a hammer. And I think that
Hmm.
for the most part, kids are finding things that are really empowering, educational, and learning how to express themselves.
Yeah, I think that social media has kind of had this. I can't say that it's been a net good, but I do think that at its best, social media has deliberately put almost everyone in contact with a trans person. Whereas I think that before we were kind of this unknown presence where maybe you had never talked to a trans person, never seen a trans person, and they were so like foreign to a person's day-to-day life. But now, if you were on Twitter 5, 6, 7 years ago, you probably met and befriended a trans person. Or if you were on Instagram, maybe you followed a trans person because they were really good at posting themselves in a fashionable way and you like the clothes that they wear or whatever. Or maybe you're on YouTube and watching people make videos about their own transitions or talking about transness in a political lens. I mean, I think all of this is good. And I think that it does. And I think that it has trickled into the way that transness has operated on screen. And it has kind of made it really interesting because cinema is usually behind the times because it takes so long to make a movie. But I think that the trans films that are coming out right now by trans directors like Vera Drew and Jessica Rovinelli and Alice McKay, like you said, they feel very right now in a way that I think is really significant and will speak well to their work aging well over time.
Yeah, it feels so fresh.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel like a YouTube generation, but I do want to acknowledge though that there is a lot of peril in that being online.
For sure.
And it is a double-edged thing,
For
despite all the good. Yeah. But I think about how Christina Jorgensen, she was an editor, wasn't she?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting to think about how she would have communicated her message, having more control in it in this age.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And,
it would have been completely different from the narrative that we eventually ended up getting. We took the image of Christine Jorgensen as like a genesis point in our book because we think that the cis perception of transness kind of formulates around the fascination with Christine Jorgensen, and then that kind of trickles through cinema in this fascinating way and influences so much to come after. But she was always kind of who we wanted to structure the first part of the book around. But I do think absolutely if she had been around today, she would have had more control over her image, and her image wouldn't have been as iconoclastic as it was when she first appeared, because there was such a taboo and such an interest and just this idea of this blue collar American soldier coming back as a blonde bombshell, like just that kind of complete
the exoticism.
Exactly. and that really controls a lot of how transness is perceived on screen up until really Buffalo Bill, and then that becomes the dominant image for about 20 years. We've only really started to see this change since 2013 or 14 probably. Which does circle back around to social media coming into prominence.
Oh, I think it's true. It kind of blows my mind. I mean, and I hadn't thought about it before reading the book, but Laverne Cox was kind of the start of an aspirational image. Just somebody gorgeous and talented and funny. So, as I've told you, it took me a very long time to get through this book. I am a speed reader, but oh my gosh, I kept stopping to look things up, to make lists so that I can make sure. So I wanted you to tell me about a few kind of standouts in the book, things that are moving to you, things that are an interesting kind of entry to the book so that people can dive in themselves with something a little more pinpointed.
I think that there are a handful of films and a handful of particular bedrock images, and there are a handful of bedrock images, films, ideas, personalities throughout this book, which are more dominant than others. We talked about Christine Jorgensen just a minute ago, but the first film to really tackle into the Christine Jorgensen idea is Ed Wood's Glenn Glinda. And Ed Wood is kind of this controversial director because the opinion of him for a very long time has been that he's one of the worst directors of all time. But Glenn Glinda is such a heartfelt, sincere plea for acceptance that I wonder where that feeling of, oh, this director is so horrible actually stems from. Because the first film that he makes that actually ends up being discussed as like a so bad it's good movie or whatever is Glen or Glenda, which is actually the first film in our book which actually directly explicitly tackles the subject of transness. And there were elements, there were films that came before Glen or Glenda which touched on transness to a degree, but Glen or Glenda is kind of the let there be light moment of transness on film. And I'm hoping that that will have somewhat of a reappraisal from people reading this book who are maybe already familiar with the concept of Ed Wood's filmography, and maybe they'll give that a second look. After that, there's Funeral Parade of Roses, which I think is the best. It's my favorite film ever made that tackles the subject of transness, and I think that it has this really beautiful transformational formal playfulness where it's constantly evolving that feels very much what it's like to be a trans person in real life. I think it's evocative of transness as its own cinematic form. There are other sections throughout the 70s and the 80s where we get into movies like Dog Day Afternoon and the Andy Warhol superstars of Candy Darling, Holly Woodlawn, and Jackie Curtis that I think are strong sections in our book. Caden is a big fan of the Rainer Werner Fassbinder film In a Year of 13 Moons, which is one of the international films that we look at. And that's a devastating movie, but I think that it speaks to us not throwing away movies from the past that are maybe more problematic through a modern lens. And I think that it's important that we keep all of these movies, even if we've moved past things like cis trans casting, because they do contribute to where trans cinema is right now. And after that, I do think that everyone is probably familiar with The Silence of the Lambs, but we get into some things in the chapter on The Silence of the Lambs, which are maybe illuminating that people don't know about relating to the John Hopkins Clinic and Buffalo Bill's experience and how it is incidentally portraying the type of experience that a lot of real trans people had in the 1980s leading up to the moment of that film coming out. And other than that, there's a lot of films scattered throughout the 90s and the aughts, which I think are important. We relitigate the history of Boys Don't Cry in a way that I think we tried to give it as much nuance and grace as possible. It's not a movie that either of us love because it was kind of this dominant trans martyr film that affected both of us in a negative way when we were younger. But we do try to interrogate that and really give it as much critical leeway as possible because it was an important film in queer cinema at the time. And then obviously we do have this hopeful, optimistic look near the end of the book where we do look at movies made by directors like Jane Schoenbrunn and Isabel Sandoval. And we're looking at the way that transness is developing on screen now. And it's really exciting because in that final chapter there were some directors for whom we had to cut for reasons of length that we really had a hard time doing because we wanted to look at all of these directors that are making films right now. And there's this ecosystem of trans directors that could really change how we interpret transness on film if they can continue to get the support that they need from producers and studios. And we end on a hopeful note, but it's really one where it's hard to see the future. With this election coming up tomorrow, we're recording the day before the election and everything's really scary. But we're hopeful that transness can continue to evolve on screen, but it's not really up to those directors. It's important to note that even when looking at these directors who have made a splash here recently, Jane Schoenbrunn couldn't have made I Saw the TV Glow without Emma Stone putting up a lot of money for it. And Vera Drew has spoken very, very openly about how The People's Joker is a movie that put her into an extreme amount of debt that she's still paying off. And it's a movie that we all love, and it's a movie that she sacrificed for. And there are other directors like Louise Weard who are trying to kickstart movies and make movies, in a way through crowd support. But I mean, is that's not as sustainable as
No.
a studio stepping in and giving trans creatives the means to do so. There's really only going to be an evolving trans cinema if these creatives are given the support that they need. But I do hope that even with me saying that, everyone listening to this podcast will seek out those movies, because we are on the cusp of a really exciting moment that kind of mirrors the new queer cinema of the 90s. The question is whether or not these directors are going to go on to have careers like Todd Haynes and Greg Araki or not. And that's something that obviously can't be answered.
I do. Yeah, I was thinking the 70s, that was the classic
Hmm.
age of Black film. In
Hmm.
90s, like you're saying, that was when queer film, that was when, I was in my 20s going to movie theaters all the time and
Yeah.
seeing queer film exposed. And I do feel like this is the moment for trans film. And it is coming at a time when on one side you have all these tools, but on the other, if you want to break out, you really do need a bigger support,
Yep.
like a studio's support.
Hmm.
So we can, as a community of film lovers, or get together and boost people, but what we really need is a change from the top
Hmm.
to just make sure that all the stories are being told. Why don't, if you have any links for people fundraising, I can put that in my show notes so that
Yeah, I
people
can do
have a
that.
way to do things now.
Hmm.
We do what we can now, but with the understanding that a lot more needs to be done. It's that idea of we're not where we used to be, but we have a lot more
Yep.
to go.
Hmm. I think that there's this idea that transness has integrated itself into society completely now, and I don't really think that's the case. I think that it has only felt like a speedy sort of integration because of things like social media, and because trans people did feel for a little while like it was safer to come out of the closet.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a hopeful part of me that thinks that now, like, the secret is out, so to speak, and there's no way of totally erasing the progress that we've made. But I don't know. I've seen political situations in countries like England and the United States go backwards. And
Hmm.
I've seen it start to trickle into my home nation of Canada. And it's frightening. And I don't know what the future holds. And I do believe that there is a familiarity with transness, from cis people now, that I don't think can be undone. And
Agree.
I do think that that will be helpful, but
Yeah,
it's
agreed.
got to get easier. Yeah.
It's a very fraught time. It's very
Hmm.
scary, the things that are happening, around
Hmm.
people's rights and safety. But I
Yeah.
agree with you. There's
The
these classic works out now,
hmm
undeniably powerful works.
hmm
You can't put that away, nor
yeah,
the
it's
people they
what
reflect.
it what I always I've been out as trans for 14 years now. And I came out when I was in my late teens. And what I tell people is that yes, all of the bigotry is very loud right now, and things are very regressive, and it's scary, but it's also probably the best it's ever been to be trans right now
Yeah.
in the span of my own lifetime. So even with the reality of how terrifying it is right now, it's obvious that progress has been made. And I do think that we've seen that represented in the film industry in some small ways as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with the film industry being so uneven
Hmm.
and unsatisfying, and it's going in a terrible direction, and yet we're still seeing
Absolutely.
these voices
Right.
coming out nevertheless. It shows how powerful
Right.
these creators are.
Right. The apparatus of capitalism is never going to be on the side of the trans person, but this book will show that we've always been making interesting art throughout the history of cinema.
And it's an undeniable classic. It's so well done. You two
Thank you.
are filling a need. in a moment that needs to be done. But I have to say, the both of you have such an elegant critical eye, and it's so accessible. This is a fun book to read, in addition to being informative, because it's so beautifully written. So I really appreciate what you two have put into this.
Thank you.
I think it's going to be a very important, tool for all of us to have for many, many years. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today, Willow. This has just been fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
For more information about Willow Catelyn Maclay and Caden Mark Gardner and their book, Corpses, Fools, and Monsters, The History and Future of Transness in Cinema, go to watchingclassicmovies.com. I've also posted a list of ways you can support several trans filmmakers and their work. Thank you for listening. This is Kendall Cruver, watching classic movies. Until next time.